Hey, Tyson here from Refuge Church in Lenoir City, Tennessee. Thank you for listening to our message today. Refuge Church is a family of faith sent to proclaim hope in Jesus Christ through relationships. For more resources and information about Refuge, please visit us on the web at refugeph.com.
All right, before we get started, a couple of announcements that I think are important. This week starts ESL, English as a Second Language, that we teach down at La Cruz Church, downtown Lenoir City. Still in need of a few volunteers. What's the time again on that, Carrie? 6:30 to 8. So if you're interested in helping on Tuesday, we're teaching English, so you don't have to know Spanish. So if you know English, you're qualified. If you know a little bit of English, you're qualified. Carrie, raise your hand. See Carrie if you're interested in helping with that. We teach that sort of the same time school's going on in semesters, so it'll be fall, and then we'll do it again in the spring. Also, if you're interested in being part of a small group, we're going to kick off small groups after Labor Day, but we're going to have a meeting after the service for anybody who's interested. We got to figure out childcare and all those things, so if you're interested in that, stay after the service. There'll be another announcement at the end. And then Awana kicks off officially this Wednesday. Awana is a huge part of our church. It's our kids' ministry. We had a huge slip and slide last Wednesday, but this week is when the real work starts. So still looking for a few volunteers for that. We would love to have a teacher for the, I'm going to get this wrong, 5th grade maybe, I don't remember. But if you're interested in doing that, Shelly's not at, what grade is it? 3rd through 5th. See, I got the 5th right. If you're interested in helping with that, see myself or Shelly. And then this week, Friday, we went to Green Hills Elementary School. It's actually a K through 8 school in Kentucky that we partner with through Mission of Hope. There was about 10 or 12 of us that went up there, took some school supplies, had a fantastic time. Good to see the kids again. We go twice every year, but because of COVID, we've not been able to do that. So it was good to go do that, eat lunch with those guys, feed the teachers. We're going to be going back at Christmas, taking Christmas presents. We would love for you to go to that. If you're interested in doing that, let myself know. All right. So we've been talking about Jesus in the Old Testament. We're going to look at a place where we're going to see someone who tries to be like Jesus, but is not quite there. And we're going to talk about why that is. But it points us to Jesus in the New Testament, right? The whole Old Testament, from Genesis to the Gospel of Matthew, points us to Jesus Christ. The whole Bible's about Jesus. That's the summation of the whole thing. It's a story of redemption. And we've been looking at this plan that God has been laying out for all of humanity ultimately, ever since Adam and Eve fell, ever since they ate the forbidden fruit, if you will. They sinned against God. We've seen God show us this plan of redemption. We've seen substitutionary atonement. We've seen Passover. We've seen how sins are forgiven by the shedding of blood. We've seen all these things, and we're going to see a little bit more of that today. So we're going to be in Exodus chapter 24 through verse 34, or chapter 34. We're not going to read all that because I'm going to get you out on time. I try to anyway. But as we think about this incident that we're going to look at today, it's really a time when Israel, it's probably their greatest failure. It's their greatest failure, and it comes quickly after God had done some pretty miraculous things. So we're going to look at this. It's called the golden calf incident. So if you've grown up in church, you've heard that. If you've not, you're going to hear it today for the first time. But a couple of questions I want to ask you, first of all, is this. Do you try to live the Christian life on your own? Because in the grand scheme of things, it's not intended to be lived on your own. Now, there's two ways really to look at that. You can live the Christian life on your own in that you can have a relationship with God, but really not any relationship with any other Christians. That would be living the Christian life on your own. It's really not designed that way. Now, you can be a Christian and be without Christian friends. You certainly can do that. There are missionaries who go into hostile parts of the world and who are alone. But the other part of that is we can try to live the Christian life alone in the fact that we don't lean on God. We can try to do it on our own. You see what I'm saying? We can be Christians and live the Christian life alone because we're trying to do it on our own. And I want us to look at that today, and I want us to kind of see where that could lead us to today. What that may look like is maybe you go through the week and you never pray. Maybe you go through the week and you never read your Bible. Maybe you go through the week and you really don't even think about God until Sunday rolls around and then you begin to think about God. That would be living the Christian life on your own. You're trying to do it in your own power. You're trying to live life in your own way. And we're going to see that that doesn't always work. The second thing I want us to look at in this passage today that I think may be important is maybe you look at yourself and you say, you know what? I'm a failure. We talked about how Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit. We're going to see how the nation of Israel, really within about 40 days of making an agreement with God, they fail miserably. And maybe you're like that. Maybe you became a Christian. You know, we've got a lot of new Christians. We baptized a lot of people this year. Maybe you're a new Christian. You're like, man, I really thought my life would be different, but I failed. I don't want you to lose heart in that. We're going to see that God is a God of second chances today. Maybe you're here today and you're not a Christian. You would say, you know what, I'm not a Christian. I've sinned. He's a God of first chances too. So we're going to see that as well. All these things, trying to live a relationship with God on our own, trying to overcome failures on our own, leads us to this strange relationship with God. As Christians, we go through our life without really acknowledging God on most occasions. Maybe we go to Him when things are bad. Maybe we've failed God, and instead of running to God, we run from God. But see, we serve a God who loves us, and I want you to know that you can run to God when you fail, not run from God. God's not sitting up there with some lightning bolt that He's going to strike you with because you failed Him. We're going to see that today. So what we're going to look at is in Exodus chapter 32, but I want to go back to Exodus chapter 24 first. God had brought the nation of Israel out of Egypt. They had been in slavery for over 400 years. And He called this man named Moses. He said, Moses, you're going to bring my people out. Through Moses, he does these miraculous things. He does all these plagues. And we get to that last plague, which is the plague of Passover. And we saw the picture of Jesus in that. And the nation of Egypt said, just get out. Just told the nation of Israel, just get out. So they take off. They've been set free, but the nation of Egypt pursues them, and they get trapped at the Red Sea, and they think that it's over. And then God parts the Red Sea for them. You've probably heard that story. Maybe even if you're not a church person, you've heard that story. And God delivers them out. So from there to where we get to where God makes this covenant is about 3 months. It's about 90 days. So 3 months after seeing what all that God had done, God makes a covenant with His people. Moses goes up on the mountain. God gives him some things that he wants to take back to the nation of Israel and say, listen, I want you to ask them if they're willing to do these things. I will be their God and they will be my people. So Moses goes down and he presents these things that God has for them in Exodus chapter 24. And this is their response. Exodus chapter 24, verse 7. It says, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. Now, I do want to say this before we go any further. Was the nation of Israel chosen? They were. God chose Abraham. These are the descendants of Abraham. They were chosen. Does the nation of Israel still have a choice? The nation of Israel has a choice. At the end of the day, you and I have a choice as to what we're going to do with God. What are we going to do with Jesus Christ? At the end of the day, it's an individual choice for you and for me. I can't make the choice for you. You can't make it for me. I can't make it for my children. You can't make it for yours. It's a choice. And God gives the nation of Israel a choice. Are you going to be obedient? And all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and he threw it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. You remember we looked at this passage a few weeks ago, and we looked at those who are covered by the blood. What does that point us to? Jesus, right? Because that's what Jesus did for us. So he ratified this covenant with blood 3 months after they came out of Egypt. Well, then Moses goes back up on the mountain for 40 days, and he says, listen, I'm going to be back in 40 days. So just hang out right here. So now we're talking about 40 days from the moment they made this agreement. Moses goes up on the mountain, and it's the last day. And the people have gotten impatient. Maybe they thought it was day 40 and it was actually day 39, but for whatever reason, they have lost faith that Moses is ever going to come back. So while they're up there, they make this golden calf. We're going to look at this story here just a little bit. It's interesting. Exodus chapter 32, verse 1. It says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So they're like, okay, Aaron. Aaron is Moses' right-hand man, and he says, Aaron stayed back. He's supposed to control the people. And the people come to him and said, listen, this Moses guy, we think he may be dead up there. So we need you, Aaron, to make us a god. Well, let me give you a little insight. If you make it, it's not a god. That should be common sense, right? You might be God because you made it. It's not true either. But certainly if you make it, it's not God. But this is what they're doing. They want to make something that they can worship. Verse 2, it says, so Aaron said to them, take off the rings of gold that are in your ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people took off their rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. So who made it? Aaron made it. He fashioned it. He made it with his hands with a graving tool. That may make you think of, where have I heard that word before? Oh yeah, the second commandment. You shall not make a graven image. This is clearly in rebellion to what they had just promised to do 40 days ago. And Aaron is the one leading the charge. And it says, and they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So now they're giving this God that they just made with their own hands credit for bringing them out of Egypt, which he didn't even exist yet because they hadn't even made him. But this is what we do. We try to put things in the place of God. And this is what sin is at the end of the day, is it's putting things in the place of God. Verse 5. And when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. So now they're going to worship before this golden calf. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. And they rose up early in the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink. And they rose up to play. Here's the thing about this. They were so serious about this. They didn't just say, hey, tomorrow when I get up, I'm going to get up about 9. I'm going to sleep in tomorrow. Then we'll worship. No, they said, listen, I'm going to get up early tomorrow and worship this thing. I normally sleep in, but tomorrow I'm getting up. This is how important this was for them. We're gonna get up early and make a day of it. How's that? And then we've got this last statement. It says they rose up to play. Most commentators think that this passage, this little statement about they rose up to play, is about they had sexual immorality around this idol that they had made. We're going to see part of that here in just a moment. So look at this. Within 130 days of being brought out of Egypt, Passover, 10 plagues, parting the Red Sea. Oh, by the way, God gave them manna every day. God gave them water from a rock. They saw God's presence by cloud in the day, fire by night. All this time, they've seen all this. 30 days from a covenant with God, we're going to obey you, and they've already failed. They failed miserably. They've broken at least the first 2 commandments, if not more, and they've done it in fantastic manner. Remember, they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And here's what we learn in this, and there's literally something about human nature in this. If we're left to ourselves, it typically leads to problems. Do you know that most sin that people commit is when we're alone? When we feel lonely, when we feel that we're alone, that's when the devil attacks us. We're tempted the most. So when we're left to ourselves, it's typically not good. You know, I've said this before. Nobody has let you down in life more than yourself. Consistently, nobody has let you down in your life more than yourself. Things that you want to do, things that you make commitments to do, and you never end up doing. So why would we trust ourselves? Here we've got the nation of Israel. They're left to themselves. Moses is up on the mountain. What are we going to do? The other thing is that we see here about human nature is we can't trust our feelings. They felt like Moses had died. They felt like he's not coming back. Do you know that our feelings can betray us? The Bible tells us that our heart is deceitful above all else. I use this example all the time. Think about who you dated in high school. And you're like, phew, I said I love them, but look. Listen, your heart can be deceitful. You cannot trust your feelings. A lot of times our feelings lead us to sin because we feel like, well, my wife owes this to me. Well, since she's not meeting my needs or vice versa, I'm due this. Our feelings betray us. So we can't trust ourselves. We can't trust our feelings. We see that in this passage. And here's the other thing. We shouldn't trust others either. This whole nation rose up together and said, we don't know where this Moses guy is. Aaron, why don't you do this for us? And you know what Aaron did? He followed the crowd. Can I tell you this? The world doesn't care whether you follow Jesus or not. They're not interested in helping you follow Jesus. So why would we listen to them for advice? Because they don't have your best interest in their mind. So you can't trust the crowd either. But we're going to see who we can trust. And I believe this. I believe that when the nation of Israel was asked to make this covenant and they said, we'll be obedient, we'll do it, I believe they meant it. Just like you and I, when we make commitments to God, I believe we mean it. We want to follow Jesus. We want to be disciple makers. We want to wake up tomorrow and have a quiet time with God. We want to wake up tomorrow and be a person who prays. But it's hard, is it not? We fall back into these same traps. What happens is we end up trusting the crowd, or we end up trying to do it on our own, or we try to just do it only when we need God. But here's the thing about this whole passage is, regardless of how the nation of Israel got here, they crossed the line. Sin is defined as missing the mark. If you can imagine hitting a bullseye with a gun or an arrow, sin is missing the bullseye, missing the mark. You only have to miss it by a little bit to miss it completely. You miss the mark. The nation of Israel crossed the line. They missed the mark. God gave them these commands, and they missed it. And there's going to be consequences to that sin. In 40 days, you think about how far they've fallen. How long does it take to completely fail? 40 days or less, looks like. I mean, it really doesn't take that long for us to fall. They had broken the covenant that was ratified by blood. Do you know what that means? This covenant that was ratified by blood, when you ratify a covenant by blood, it means whatever happens, if we fail this covenant, it will require the shedding of blood. That's what that means. And so they've broken the covenant. Moses goes back to God and he says, hey God, remember when you said to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that you would swear by your own self? You remember we looked at this covenant. It was the very first covenant of Abraham. When God had Abraham cut these animals in half and they were going to walk between them. Again, this is a covenant. So whatever happens, if we break this covenant, we'll be cut in half. That's sort of the idea. Did both Abraham and God walk through that? No, just God did. Right? So God promised to himself. God made that promise. This is what Moses is reminding God of in this moment. As he goes back up and he has this encounter with God, and God's like, listen, these people, they've messed up. They've crossed the line. He says, your people have sinned. They've created a graven image. They've created a golden calf. They're down there worshiping it. So Moses and Joshua, they come down. It's time for them to come down. Moses brings the tablets that God had written with his own finger. And they come down there, and as they get close, Joshua says, man, it sounds like they're at war. And it wasn't war they were having, they were worshiping. It was all kinds of stuff, as you can imagine. And they get down there, and Moses sees it, and he throws the tablets down, and they break. Moses broke the law, you could say, because the nation of Israel had broken the law. He was so mad, he broke the law. He took the calf, and he burned it up into dust, and he poured it on the water, and he made them drink it. It's sort of like, young people don't understand this, but us older people do. And yes, I'm an older person. If your parents ever told you, I'm going to wash your mouth out with soap, that's basically what just happened. And yes, parents used to do that. I mean, that's part of it. You said the wrong thing, you had to put soap in your mouth. So, hey, maybe we need to go back to that. But anyway, this is what Moses did as part of the punishment. And Moses goes to Aaron and he says, hey, Aaron, I left you in charge. What happened? And Aaron's like, man, he goes, they brought me all this gold. We put it in the fire and then poof, this cow came out. I mean, that's literally what he said. He goes, it just showed up. But we know that Aaron made it, right? So Aaron's even lying about what's going on. So let's pick it up in Exodus chapter 32, verse 25. And Moses saw that the people had broken loose, for Aaron had let them break loose to the derision of their enemies. Then Moses stood in the gate of the camp, and he said, who is on the Lord's side? Come to me. And all the sons of Levi gathered around him. So he said, listen, in the middle of this worship service, all this is going on. He says, listen, I want to know who's on God's side. And the Levites, that's a family of the 12 tribes of Judah, came and they stood with Moses, and they said, we're on your side. And he said, okay, I want all of y'all to grab a sword. There's judgment to be made. And they go out and they kill some people. And you're like, whoa, hey. He killed about 3,000 people that day. Companions, neighbors, friends. And what most people say is, you remember that whole statement about they rose up to play? Those people who were doing sexual immorality around this thing, that's who they killed. And the rest of them are like, okay, what's going on? So we pick it up in verse 30 of Exodus 32. It says, the next day Moses said to the people, you have sinned a great sin, and now I will go up to the Lord, and perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. So now we're seeing this picture of Moses, a great leader who says, listen, Aaron, you've messed this up. We're in bad shape here. In less than 40 days, we have completely fell apart. I'm going to go back to God, and I'm going to try to make atonement for sin. See, what Moses has picked up on all along is that God will take a substitution for an atonement for sin. He saw it in the Passover. He's seen it when he introduced the tabernacle. And we talked about Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. We talked about all these sacrifices that were to be made. So Moses says, listen, I'm going to go up and I'm going to make atonement for your sin. Look what happens, verse 31. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold. But now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. Here's what Moses says. God, if you won't forgive them, just put it all on me. They deserve to die, but if you won't forgive them, just kill me in their place. Now, who does that sound like? Sounds like Jesus, right? But here's the thing. God doesn't accept Moses' offer. Why not? Because Moses falls far short of Jesus. Moses was far from a perfect man. Remember, the sacrifice of atonement had to be a spotless lamb. Jesus was the spotless lamb. So here's what this picture points us to. Although God did not accept Moses' self-sacrifice, it points us to the one who does make the sacrifice for us and who is perfect, and he sacrifices for all time, and that's Jesus. Verse 31, so Moses returned to the Lord and said, alas, this people, verse 32. It says, but now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. It reminds me of Acts chapter 9. You can go to Acts chapter 9 and read this about Paul. Paul says this, he says, I wish that I would be accursed so that my fellow countrymen would know Christ. What Paul was literally saying in that moment is, I'm willing to go to hell so that my fellow countrymen, the Jews, would know Christ. Did God accept Paul's sacrifice either? No. Matter of fact, Jesus had already died for them. So we see this. We see Moses is held in the high regards in the nation of Israel. He's held in high regards to most Christians, but he's far from Jesus Christ. He points us to Jesus, but he is not Jesus. So now Moses goes back up on the mountain. He's got to get some new tablets. He sort of broke his other one. He's on the Apple Care plan, so he's got to go back, get him a new tablet. And when he comes back down, guess what day it is? Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So on that day, when Moses comes back down with the law, They make atonement for the sin that temporarily covers the price of sin, pointing to Jesus, right? That's what the Day of Atonement does. So let's go a step forward into Exodus chapter 33, verse 1. The story goes on from here. Yes, this points us to Jesus, but there's more in this story for us, and I think it's fantastic. Exodus chapter 33, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go to a land flowing with milk and honey." So here's what God is telling the nation of Israel. I'm going to keep my promise. Even though you didn't keep yours, you said you would obey, but you didn't. I'm going to keep my promise, and I'm going to let you go into this land that I promised Abraham way back over 400 years ago. That's what kind of God he is. But he's not done. Look at the last part of the statement. But I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way. You are a stiff-necked people. He says, listen, you can have the promised land. It's everything we said it was going to be. Full of milk and honey, cows and bees, right? It's full of all that stuff. You can have it, but I'm not going with you. So we have this moment here when we see that we can have everything that God has promised us and not get God. And we have to ask ourselves, do we want heaven and things of heaven like mansions, streets of gold, all those things? Or do we want God? Because the purpose of heaven is God. It's not streets of gold and mansions. The purpose is we get God personally in a relationship. And here, God is saying, listen, you can have all that stuff, but I'm not going with you. So what's more important to us? We'll look at Exodus chapter 33, verse 4. When the people heard this disastrous word, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments, for the Lord had said to Moses, "Say to the people of Israel, you are a stiff-necked people. If for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. So now take off your ornaments, that I may know what to do with you." Therefore the people of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments from Mount Horeb onward. Jump down to verse 12. Moses said to the Lord. So Moses goes back to the Lord, and he's going to talk to him. And he says, "See, you say to me, bring this people up, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight." He's talking about Moses has found favor in his sight. Verse 13, "Now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you." Now here's what separates Moses from most people. Moses has conversations with God on the mountain. It's how he got the 10 Commandments. He had spent 40 days up there a couple of times. He would speak with him in the tabernacle. And he says, listen, I want to know you more. Like Moses knows him better than anybody. And he says, listen, I want to know you more. And see, when we really get to know God, it should make us want to know him more. And this is where Moses is at. He says, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people. And he said, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. He reminds God of his promise, not that God needs to be reminded. But he says, you remember, you said you would go with us and give us rest. Where does that point us to? You remember last week we talked about the Sabbath and rest? That's what that points us to. Verse 15, and he said to him, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. And here's what Moses says. And I think this is fantastic. Moses says, hey God, if you're not going, we're not going. We don't want the promised land, God, unless you're in it. I mean, that's what it takes to be a leader. And Moses stood up in this moment to God and said, God, we're not going. He's literally telling God, here's God, what we want. We want you more than we want that stuff. And I think we as Christians have to do the same. Verse 16, it says, for how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us? so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth? He says, listen, God, you are who make us who we are. Our identity is found in you and the fact that you're with us. And if you don't go with us, we're nobody. You're the one that set us apart from everybody else. Verse 17, and the Lord said to Moses, this very thing that you have spoken I will do, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. That's a personal thing. God says, listen, not only do you know me, I know you personally. And Moses says, please show me your glory. Here's another thing that Moses is saying in this moment. I want to know you more. It's basically the same thing. I want to see more of your glory. We talk about glory a lot of times in the church. What is that? He's going to describe it for us here in just a second. Chapter 34, verse 5. The Lord descended in a cloud. So here's what happens. Moses says, I want to see your glory. And God says, okay, I'm going to show you my glory. I'm going to hide you in this rock. I'm going to go by you. Nobody's ever seen God. He says, so I'm going to go by you. And when I walk past you, you'll be able to look back at me and see the backside of my glory. So that's what happens. That's where we're going to pick it up in chapter 34, verse 5. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there, and he proclaimed the name of the Lord. What did Moses ask to be shown? His glory. What is God's glory? His name. Why is that important? Your name describes who you are. Now, we don't really do that these days, but especially in the Old Testament time, your name really meant something. It meant who you were. It was a description of what kind of person you were. And for them to say, God, what is your name? You remember we looked at that when they called Moses. He said, what is your name? What they're really asking is, God, what are you like? What's your character like? And God's character, his name, is his glory, is what he's saying. And then he describes himself. The Lord passed by before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. That's the God who we serve. That's the God who we want to know is the faithful God, the forgiving God, the merciful God. And thank goodness he's that way, because we have no chance without him being those things. But that's not all he is. Look on, it says, forgiving the iniquity and transgressions and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generations. God still holds people accountable. The question is, who's going to stand before God one day? If you don't know Jesus Christ, you'll stand before God and you'll give an account for your own life. But if we put our faith and trust in Jesus, guess what? We stand before God with Jesus in front of us. What God sees is not us, he sees Jesus. That's the greatness of who Jesus is. But what's interesting about this passage, and I think we see this in real life, is that the sins of the father can be passed down. It's not just fathers, it's fathers and mothers. We see this in life, right? And what he's trying to tell us is that sin has consequences. When a father or mother sins, it affects the whole family. And it may affect their grandkids and on down. See, God forgives sin, but it doesn't relieve us of the consequences of sin. And what we do affects not just us, but other people. Verse 8, and Moses quickly bowed his head toward earth and worshipped. And he said, now if I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, please let the Lord go in the midst of us, for it is a stiff-necked people, and pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance. He says, God, now will you go with us? And if you know the rest of the story, he does. So I'm going to ask Morgan and the band to come up here as we finish. Here's what I want us to think about. Two things that I think come from this passage, despite the fact that this points us to Jesus, is number one, God is a God of second chances. Did the nation of Israel deserve a second chance? 40 days. They couldn't wait 40 days. They waited 39 days, and they failed. But God gave them a second chance. And by the way, if you read the rest of the Old Testament, he gave them a third chance, he gave them a fourth chance, he gave them a fifth chance. There's a lot of books in the Old Testament. It's all about chances that the nation of Israel has gotten. So I give you good news, and to know that if you have failed, if you have fallen short, man, God is a God of second chances. First of all, if you're a Christian and you have fallen short, God is a God of second chances. Don't run from God, run to God when you fail. And maybe you're here today, you've never put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ. God is a God of first chances as well. He's here to have a relationship with you. It says that He knew Moses face to face like a man. He said, I know Moses by name. What does that mean? He knew Moses' character. He knew what kind of person he is. At the end of the day, God doesn't want to just give you some blessing of heaven. God wants to have a relationship with you, a personal relationship with you. And you can do that through Jesus Christ. The second part of the story is this. You got a real contrast between two different people. Moses, who was up on the mountain with God, and Aaron, who was down with the people. You know what's the only thing that separates Moses from Aaron? Was their location. Moses was in the presence of God, and Aaron wasn't. And if we're not careful, we as Christians, we can live life as a Christian, but not really living out the presence of God. We can go through life and never pray, never hear from God through His Word, maybe go to church every now and then, and we're really in a not much better place than where Aaron was, other than the fact we have the Holy Spirit living inside of us. But if we don't allow Him to live in and through us, it really makes not much difference. The difference in Moses was that he was in the presence of God daily. He spent time with God. He knew God. God knew him. So I have a question for us as Christians. Are you a Moses or are you an Aaron? Are you spending time with God on a regular basis? Are you praying? Are you reading His Word? Are you worshiping? The Christian life is not meant to be lived alone. It's meant to be lived in a relationship with God on a daily basis. If we're not careful, we can live it like Aaron and we fall into sin when we do. Would you pray with me? God, we come to you today, God. Some of us are in a position of Aaron. We're far from you. Yes, we're Christians. We put our faith and trust in you, but maybe we're far from you. God, would you draw us back? We want to know you more. We should be like Moses. God, show me your glory. God, if you're not going with us, we're not going. Maybe today you put a stake in the ground that today's the day that you're not leaving here until you know that God's with you. And you're going to make a commitment to know Him more and to get to know Him, and He'll reveal Himself to you. Maybe you're here today and you're not a Christian. Maybe today you put a stake in the ground and say, listen, today I'm quit going my own way. I'm putting my faith and trust in Jesus. I want to know God and know Him personally. Maybe you do that today. In Jesus' name, amen. Would you stand and worship?
Thank you for listening to this message today brought to you by Refuge Church. Please visit our website for more resources as well as our YouTube channel. Just search for Refuge Church in Lenoir City, Tennessee to find us. We hope that this message has helped you find hope in Jesus Christ.